Hello, welcome to the Heartbreak Stories channel. Today's story is about a man who discovered his wife's betrayal, and instead of falling apart, he quietly built the most precise response of his life. Now let's listen.
My wife smiled at me across the dinner table while texting her boyfriend under it. I said nothing. I signed nothing. I just moved every dollar we owned somewhere she'd never find it. Then I handed her the papers at the exact restaurant where she once promised to love me forever. My name is Spencer Odom. I'm 44 years old, and for the past 17 years I've been building two things simultaneously: a commercial contracting business and a marriage. Both took everything I had. Both looked solid from the outside. One of them was hollow at the core, and I didn't know it until the whole structure gave way. I grew up in Raleigh, North Carolina, the kind of kid who worked summers doing drywall with his uncle and spent winters figuring out how money moved. By my late 20s, I had my own crew. By my mid-30s, Odom and Associates was pulling in serious municipal contracts, schools, county buildings, a couple of hospital wings. I wasn't flashy about it. I drove a 4-year-old truck, kept the same office I started in, and reinvested almost everything back into the company. My financial advisor, a dry but brilliant man named Patrick Sears, used to shake his head and tell me I was sitting on a fortune I refused to enjoy. I enjoyed other things. I enjoyed coming home to Joanna. We met at a mutual friend's barbecue when I was 26. She was 23, finishing a marketing degree, and she had this laugh that made the whole yard feel warmer. We married 3 years later and bought a 4-bedroom house in Cary. Good schools, quiet streets, the kind of neighborhood where people still wave from driveways. When Tyler was born 14 years ago, I remember standing in the hospital hallway at 2 in the morning thinking, this is it. This is what all the work is for. For a long time, that feeling held. But if I'm being straight with you, the warning signs were there years before I admitted them. Not loud, dramatic ones. Just the quiet kind. The kind of man steps over every morning until one day he looks down and realizes the floor has been shifting under his feet the whole time. Joanna worked in marketing at a mid-sized tech consulting firm downtown. She was good at her job, ambitious in a quiet way, and she kept that part of her life mostly separate from ours at home. I respected that. I had my world, she had hers, and Tyler was the place where those worlds always met. We were good parents. I'll say that without hesitation. Whatever else broke between us, we were good parents. The distance started, I think, about 2 years before everything fell apart. I noticed it in the small things first. She stopped asking about the business. Not rudely, just stopped. Evenings that used to end with both of us on the back porch with a beer became evenings where she disappeared upstairs with her laptop. When I suggested a long weekend up in the Smoky Mountains, something we used to do every fall, she smiled the way you smile at a child's drawing. That sounds nice, Spencer. Then nothing. I told myself she was stressed. Her company had brought in a new senior project team, and there'd been a shuffle in responsibilities. Change was hard. I understood change. What I didn't understand yet was that one of those new senior arrivals was a man named Shane Pruitt. I wouldn't learn his name for another few months. That October evening, I was in the kitchen finishing up some invoices when Joanna came through the back door later than usual. She smelled different. Not perfume exactly, just different, like she'd been somewhere that wasn't the office. I looked up. She set her bag on the counter without meeting my eyes and said something about a project deadline running long. Everything okay? I asked. Just tired, she replied, already moving toward the stairs. I watched her go. Tyler was upstairs doing homework. Our house was warm and lit, and everything looked completely normal. That's the part that stays with me. Everything looked completely normal. I went back to my invoices. I told myself the distance I felt was just the weather, something seasonal, something that would pass. I was a man who built structures for a living. I knew how to read load-bearing walls, how to spot a foundation problem before it became a collapse. I missed every single sign. Shane Pruitt walked into Joanna's professional life the same way a slow leak walks into a wall, quietly, without announcement, and by the time you notice the damage, it's already structural. I didn't know his name until November. But looking back, the signs were already there in October, wearing the same ordinary clothes as everything else in our daily routine. Joanna started talking about work differently. Not more, actually less, but with a different energy underneath. She'd come home, and instead of the usual flat rundown of meetings and deadlines, she'd sometimes smile at her phone before setting it face down on the counter. Small thing. Easy to explain away. I explained it away about a dozen times before I stopped bothering. The first time she mentioned Shane, it was casual. Almost too casual. "There's a new senior guy on the Henderson account," she said one evening, not looking up from the salad she was putting together. "Shane Pruitt. He's sharp. Really good at client management." "Good," I replied from across the kitchen island. "You could use some backup on that account." She nodded, and that was the end of it. Or so I thought. Over the next few weeks, Shane Pruitt's name came up the way a song comes up on the radio. Not constantly, but enough that you start knowing the melody. Shane suggested a different presentation format. Shane handled that client call really well. Shane has this way of reading a room. I listened to all of it and filed it under work colleague. I had no reason to do anything else. Meanwhile, something else was shifting, and this one I noticed more clearly. Russell Malone had been my best friend since we were both 23 and sharing a beat-up duplex off Hillsborough Street. He'd gone on to become one of the sharper family law attorneys in Wake County. We grabbed lunch every few weeks at a diner on Western Boulevard. Same booth, same bad coffee, same easy conversation. That November, we were halfway through our burgers when Russell set us down and looked at me with that flat, careful expression he uses in courtrooms. "You doing all right, Spence?" he asked. "Fine. Why?" "Joanna seemed off when I saw her at Katie's thing last weekend," Russell said, measuring each word. "Distracted. On her phone a lot." I told him what I'd been telling myself. New account, new team member, busy season. Russell nodded slowly, the way he nods when he's deciding how much to say. He picked his burger back up and changed the subject. At the time, I thought he was just being a good friend, letting it go. I was half right. He was being a good friend. He just wasn't letting it go. What I didn't know then, what I wouldn't know for another month, was that Russell had gotten a call from Casey Wren, Joanna's closest friend, a week before that lunch. Casey had seen something. She hadn't been sure what to do with it. She called Russell because she trusted him, because she didn't know how to come to me directly, and because somewhere in her gut she knew this was already bigger than a phone habit. Russell didn't tell me any of that over burgers. He just watched me, and he listened, and he quietly started making mental notes. Back at home, Tyler was the one who first made me feel something I couldn't immediately name. My son has always been perceptive in that quiet, 14-year-old way. He doesn't broadcast his observations, he just stores them. One evening in late November, I was helping him with a history paper at the kitchen table when Joanna's phone buzzed on the counter. She was upstairs. The screen lit up briefly. I wasn't trying to read it. I just happened to be facing that direction. I didn't catch the full message, only the contact name. Shane. I looked back at Tyler's paper. My son hadn't looked up, but his pencil had stopped moving for exactly 2 seconds before it started again. He'd seen it too. Neither of us said a word. That night, I lay awake longer than usual. I wasn't in a panic. I wasn't even fully suspicious yet. Or maybe I was, and I just wasn't ready to call it that. What I felt was more like the particular alertness of a man on a job site who hears a sound he can't immediately identify. You don't stop what you're doing. You just start paying a different kind of attention. I thought about Joanna and the version of her I'd married. The one who grabbed my hand at football games and stayed up late talking about nothing important. I thought about Tyler at the kitchen table, his pencil pausing for 2 seconds. I thought about Russell's careful eyes over a bad cup of coffee. And I thought about Shane Pruitt, a man I'd never met, whose name had somehow moved into my home and started rearranging the furniture. I made myself a promise that night, lying in the dark while Joanna slept beside me, her breathing steady and untroubled. I wasn't going to blow anything up. I wasn't going to make accusations I couldn't back up, but I was done explaining away what I was seeing. Starting the next morning, I was going to pay attention. The right kind of attention. The thing about 14-year-old boys is that they see more than they let on. They're at that age where the world is starting to reveal its real shape. Not the sanitized version adults present, but the actual version with all its jagged edges. Tyler had always been sharp. I'd taken pride in that. I just hadn't counted on that sharpness turning inward toward our family before I'd had a chance to prepare him for what it might mean. It was a Saturday morning in early December, 2 weeks after I'd watched Joanna's phone light up with Shane's name. Joanna had left early for what she called a team strategy session on a Saturday, which she'd explained as an end-of-quarter push. I didn't argue. I was watching now, storing things. Tyler and I were in the kitchen, me with coffee, him with a bowl of cereal he was eating without much enthusiasm. "Dad," he said, not looking up, "can I use your laptop?" "Mina's updatings." "Sure. It's on the desk in the office." He slid off the stool, then stopped at the doorway. He turned around slowly, and when he looked at me, there was something in his expression I hadn't seen before, something older than 14 and heavier. "Dad," he said again, quieter this time, "I saw something on Mom's iPad last week. When I was looking for the Netflix password, I set my coffee down. What did you see, bud?" He pulled in a breath. "Messages from some guy named Shane." He paused, his jaw tight the way mine gets when I'm working through something I'd rather not say out loud. They weren't about work. The kitchen went very still. I kept my voice even, not for my sake, but for his. "How long have you known?" "A week," he admitted. "Maybe a little more." I didn't know what to do with it. I crossed the kitchen and put my hand on his shoulder. He was almost as tall as me now. This kid I'd carried on my back through a dozen national parks and coached through 7 years of Little League. "You don't have to do anything with it," I told him firmly. "That's my job, not yours. You understand?" He nodded, but his eyes were wet. He blinked it back fast, my son keeping it together.
I have to stop here for a second. This boy is 14 years old, and he's the one holding it together. That's not just a marriage falling apart. That's a child carrying weight that was never supposed to be his.
"I'm not going to fall apart," I said quietly. "And neither are you. We're going to be okay." He nodded again and went to get the laptop. I turned back to my coffee and stood at the kitchen counter for a long moment, looking out the window at the backyard, the place that I'd built when Tyler was 4, the fence I'd replaced 2 summers ago, the life I'd constructed board by board. Then I picked up my phone and texted Russell. "Need to talk. In person. Monday." His reply came in under a minute. "I'll clear my lunch. My office. Underscore. Russell's office was on the 4th floor of a building downtown, all clean lines and legal journals. He poured us both coffee from a carafe on the credenza and sat across from me without any preamble. "Talk," he said. I laid it out, everything. The behavior changes, the phone habits, the name I'd seen on the screen, and now Tyler. Russell listened without interrupting, his elbows on the desk, his hands folded under his chin. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You want to know your options?" he said finally. It wasn't a question. "I want to know everything," I replied. "Every option, every implication. I'm not doing anything half-measured." Russell nodded slowly. "Okay, first thing, don't confront her yet. Not until we know the full picture." He leaned forward. "Second thing, you have a business, Spence. Odom and Associates is a significant asset. Before anything goes public, before papers get filed, we need to look very carefully at how that business is structured." He said it carefully, the way Russell says things he means you to take seriously. I looked at him. "You're saying protect it. I'm saying understand it," he replied. "What you do with that understanding is up to you." I drove home that afternoon with Russell's words sitting in the passenger seat beside me. That evening I called Patrick Sears, my financial advisor, and asked him to schedule a meeting. Urgent. Confidential. Patrick didn't ask questions. He knew my tone well enough. I went through the rest of that evening running the same plays I ran on every job site. Calm surface, full attention underneath. Joanna came home at 7, carrying takeout bags and talking about traffic. Tyler was polite at dinner. No more, no less. I watched them both across the table and thought about foundations, what holds, what doesn't, and what a man has to do when he finally decides to stop pretending the structure is sound. Patrick Sears kept an office in a low-profile building off Six Forks Road. No sign on the door, just a suite number. He had managed my finances for 11 years and was the kind of man who treated other people's money with a seriousness bordering on the religious. When I sat down across from him that Wednesday morning and told him I needed a full structural review of every asset attached to my name, he didn't flinch. Personal, business, or both? He asked, pen already out. Everything, I said. He worked through it methodically over the next 2 hours. Odom and Associates was structured as an LLC with me as the sole managing member. Clean, straightforward. The business accounts were separate from our joint personal accounts, which was something I'd insisted on from the beginning, a habit born from watching my father lose everything in a messy divorce when I was 12. I'd always kept the walls up between business and personal finances. It turned out that instinct was about to serve me better than I'd ever imagined. Patrick walked me through what a restructuring would look like. A move of my ownership stake into a separate holding entity, a process that was entirely legal, entirely documentable, and entirely invisible to someone who wasn't paying close attention to corporate filings. It would take 3 to 4 weeks. It needed to happen before anything became official. You're sure about this? Patrick asked, looking at me over his glasses. I've never been more sure of anything, I told him. Russell had already drafted the preliminary paperwork by the time I called him from the parking lot. He had a contact at a business valuation firm, someone discreet, who could establish a formal value for the company. That number would matter later, in court if it came to that. Russell's tone was measured and professional, but I'd known him long enough to hear the loyalty underneath it. One more thing, Russell added before I hung up. Casey Wren called me again. I paused. Joanna's Casey? Yeah. He hesitated just a beat. She's been sitting on something for a while, Spence. She wants to talk to you directly. I think you should let her. I met Casey at a coffee shop on Glenwood Avenue 2 days later, a Friday afternoon. She was already there when I arrived, both hands wrapped around her mug, her expression carrying the particular guilt of someone who has held a secret longer than they should have. She didn't waste time. I saw them together in October, she said, keeping her voice low, at a wine bar on Fayetteville Street. They didn't see me. It wasn't a work dinner, Spencer. The way they were sitting, the way she was looking at him. She stopped, shook her head. I should have come to you sooner. I kept telling myself maybe I was wrong. You weren't wrong, I said quietly. I'm sorry, Casey replied, and her voice broke slightly on the last word. She's my best friend, and I couldn't watch you walk blind into this. I thanked her. I meant it. I drove home and sat in my truck in the driveway for 10 minutes before going inside, letting the full weight of it settle into my bones. Not grief exactly, something colder and more deliberate. The feeling a man gets when the last piece of a picture clicks into place and the image is exactly as bad as he'd feared. Inside, Joanna was cooking dinner. Tyler was at soccer practice. The house smelled like garlic and rosemary, and Joanna was humming something under her breath. I stood in the kitchen doorway and watched her for a moment. She turned and gave me a quick smile. Good day, she asked. Productive, I answered, and went upstairs to change. Downstairs, Joanna kept humming. In my office, I quietly sent Russell a 2-word text, move forward. The restructuring took 26 days. Patrick moved methodically, filing the necessary paperwork in the right sequence, keeping everything clean and documented. By the first week of January, Odom and Associates existed inside a holding entity that bore my name alone. The joint accounts Joanna and I shared had been quietly reduced to a functional balance, enough to look normal, not enough to represent anything significant. The real weight had shifted somewhere she couldn't reach without a court order and a very good lawyer. I went through the holidays on autopilot. Christmas with Tyler, Joanna playing the part of attentive mother, me playing the part of steady husband. I cooked the brisket I always cooked. I sat through Christmas morning and watched my son open his gifts and told myself, hold the line a little longer. Tyler and I had found a quiet understanding between us. We didn't talk about it directly, but I saw in the way he stayed close to me that week, the way he'd catch my eye across a room and give me a small nod. My son was 14 years old and carrying more than a kid should have to carry. That burned me more than anything else. What broke the surface in January had nothing to do with me. Joanna worked at a firm called Crestline Solutions, mid-sized tech consulting, about 200 employees across 3 offices. Shane Pruitt had been brought in as senior project lead on their biggest account. What I learned later, and what Joanna almost certainly didn't know when she started her little adventure, was that Shane had a very particular habit of making himself indispensable to people who had access to things he wanted. The Crestline IT security team had been quietly flagging anomalies since November. Certain client files had been accessed from unusual IP addresses. Certain proprietary documents had been forwarded to external servers in small enough increments to avoid triggering automatic alerts, but not small enough to escape a human analyst who was specifically looking. By January, they had enough to open a formal internal investigation, and Shane Pruitt's name was at the center of it. The problem for Joanna was proximity. She and Shane had collaborated closely on the Henderson account for 4 months. She'd had full access to the same file systems he'd been mining. When the investigators started pulling access logs, her credentials showed up alongside his in places they shouldn't have been. Not because she'd been deliberately feeding him data, but because he'd borrowed her login on at least 3 occasions when she'd left her workstation unlocked. She hadn't even known it was happening. But an internal investigation doesn't much care about intent in the early stages. It cares about patterns. I found out about the investigation not from Joanna, but from Russell, who had a contact an employment law firm that did work for Crestline's parent company. He called me on a Tuesday evening, his voice carrying that particular careful neutrality he reserves for news he knows will land hard. "The investigation is real," he said. "They've suspended her access pending review. She probably doesn't know yet that it's coming. My guess is they notify her this week." "Is she in legal trouble?" I asked. "Unknown," Russell replied. "Depends on what they find. But her name is in the report, Spence. That's public enough to do damage regardless of the outcome." I sat with that for a moment. I didn't feel satisfaction. I didn't feel grief. I felt the peculiar stillness of a man watching a set of dominoes fall in exactly the sequence he'd expected. "How's your end?" Russell asked. "Ready," I said. Joanna came home 2 days later, pale and shaking, her voice stripped of its usual composure. She'd been called into HR that morning and informed that she was on paid administrative leave while the security audit was completed. She stood in the kitchen and told me about it in a rush, her hands gripping the back of a chair, her story already shaped around the version that made her blameless. I listened to the whole thing. I asked measure questions. I kept my face open and my tone steady while she leaned on me the way she'd stopped leaning on me 8 months ago. "They think I was involved," she said, her voice fracturing. "Spencer, I swear I had no idea what Shane was doing. I never shared anything deliberately. I would never." "I believe you didn't know," I said carefully. And the strange thing was I did. Shane Pruitt had used her. He'd used her access, her position, and whatever feelings she'd let herself develop. And she was only now beginning to understand the full shape of what she'd walked into. I handed her a glass of water and told her to call an employment attorney in the morning. She nodded, grateful for the practicality of it, mistaking my calm for forgiveness. It wasn't forgiveness. It was patience. I still had one more move to make. Russell booked the table at Oakwood Grill on a Wednesday evening in late January. The restaurant sat on Hillsborough Street, a few blocks from the duplex where Russell and I had lived at 23, a detail that was not lost on me when I chose it. Joanna and I had celebrated our 10th anniversary there, in a corner booth by the window, over a bottle of wine we couldn't really afford at the time and didn't care about at all. I made the reservation myself, under my own name, and told Joanna it was a chance to reset, that I'd been thinking about everything she was going through with the investigation, and that whatever was happening at Crestline, we needed to reconnect. She got dressed carefully that evening. I noticed. I didn't say anything. Russell arrived 40 minutes before we did. He sat at the bar with a club soda and his briefcase, wearing the same dark suit he wore to every difficult conversation. When Joanna and I walked in, she didn't see him. I did. We exchanged the briefest nod. The first 30 minutes were almost pleasant in a hollow sort of way. Joanna ordered the salmon. I ordered the ribeye. We talked about Tyler's upcoming spring semester and a repair the house needed. She seemed genuinely relaxed, relieved, maybe, to be out of the house and sitting across from a husband who appeared to have weathered her crisis without flinching. Then she reached across the table and cover my hand with hers. "Spencer," she said softly, "I want you to know that I'm going to make everything right. With work, with us. I know I've been distant. I know things haven't been good between us, and I take responsibility for that. I want to fix it." I looked at her hand on mine. Then I looked at her face. "I know about Shane," I said. The color left her face in a single, visible wave. Her hand didn't move at first. Then it did, pulling back slowly, as if the table between us had suddenly become something she needed distance from. "Spencer, not the work situation," I said, keeping my voice level and quiet. "I mean everything. The wine bar on Fayetteville Street in October. The text messages. The Florida seminar you were supposedly attending in November." I paused. "I've known since before Christmas, Joanna. I've just been waiting for the right moment." She stared at me. Her mouth opened and closed once. Then something shifted in her expression, the initial shock giving way to something more complicated, something that looked briefly like anger, which I found almost impressive given the circumstances. "How long have you been planning this?" she asked, her voice dropping low. "Long enough," I replied. Russell appeared at the edge of my peripheral vision, approaching the table with his briefcase in hand and his expression professionally blank. He set the envelope on the table between us with the quiet precision of a man who had done this before, which he had. "Joanna," he said simply, "you should have an attorney look at these before you sign anything." But Spencer would like to proceed without delay. She looked at the envelope. She looked at me. Then she looked around the room. At the corner booth by the window where we'd sat on our 10th anniversary, at the restaurant that had once represented something warm and real between us, and I watched her understand, fully and finally, why I had chosen this particular place. "You planned all of this," she said, and now her voice was stripped down to something almost quiet. "The dinner. The location. Russell." Her eyes came back to mine. "You've been planning this for months." "I have," I said simply. She sat very still for a moment. Then she reached for the envelope. "There's something else you should know," I said before she opened it. The business restructuring was completed in early January. Odom and Associates is no longer a marital asset. I kept my voice even and factual the way I deliver project updates. Patrick handled it cleanly. Russell reviewed everything. It's all documented. Joanna's hand stopped on the envelope. The full weight of what that meant moved across her face in slow, distinct stages, confusion, calculation, and then a pale, hollow recognition. She had come into this dinner thinking she was going to save her marriage. She was leaving it with nothing but paperwork and the dawning understanding that the man sitting across from her had been 3 moves ahead of her for the better part of 2 months. She opened the envelope. She looked at the first page. She set it down. "I want you out of the house by the end of the week," I said quietly. "Tyler stays." She didn't argue. I think in that moment, she understood there was no argument to make. Shane Pruitt was gone by the first week of February. Not fired, terminated for cause, which in corporate language means the kind of exit that follows you. Crestline Solutions had presented him with a 20-page summary of findings and escorted him out of the building on a Tuesday afternoon with a box of desk items and a non-disclosure agreement he reportedly refused to sign. By Wednesday morning, 3 of his former colleagues had talked. By Thursday, a regional business newsletter had picked up the story. The headline wasn't kind. Carla Pruitt filed for divorce the same week, and she did it loudly. She called Joanna directly. I heard about this from Russell, not from Joanna, and told her in specific and unambiguous terms exactly what she thought of the situation. Carla was not a woman who processed betrayal quietly, and whatever she said in that phone call left Joanna pale and shaking for the better part of a day. I came home that evening to find Joanna sitting at the kitchen table with a glass of wine she hadn't touched, staring at nothing. Tyler was upstairs. She looked up when I walked in, and for a moment I saw something in her face that might have broken me 6 months earlier. Genuine remorse, the kind that arrives too late to be useful. "Carla called me," she said. "I know," I replied, setting my keys on the counter. She said. Joanna stopped, pressed her lips together. She said a lot of things. I imagine she did. Joanna wrapped both hands around the wine glass without lifting it. "Spencer, I need you to know that I never wanted any of this to." Joanna. My voice was quiet but final, the tone I use when a conversation has reached its natural end. You need to focus on finding a good attorney. That's the most useful thing you can do right now. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she nodded and looked back at the table. I went upstairs, checked in on Tyler, homework spread across his bed, headphones around his neck, and told him dinner would be ready in 30 minutes. He gave me a nod and a small, tired smile. The kind of smile that said, "I know, Dad. I know you've got it." That smile kept me moving. The next 2 weeks brought the full weight of public consequence down on Joanna's side of the story. Crestline's investigation had cleared her of intentional involvement. Shane had used her credentials without her knowledge, and the audit trail confirmed it. But cleared didn't mean invisible. Her name had appeared in enough internal communications that when the story circulated through professional networks, it circulated with her attached to it. Colleagues stopped reaching out. A lunch she'd scheduled with 2 former clients was quietly canceled with vague apologies. She wasn't ruined professionally, but she was marked. And in a city like Raleigh, where professional circles overlapped like Venn diagrams, marked was enough to set a career back by years. Shane, for his part, had moved on in the most literal sense possible. By mid-February, he'd relocated to Charlotte, where he apparently had an uncle willing to give him a soft landing. Carla kept the house. Their 2 kids stayed with her. The story of Shane Pruitt ended not with drama, but with the particular quiet of a man who had burned everything around him and then simply left town to avoid the smoke. Joanna moved into a short-term rental in late February, a furnished apartment in North Raleigh, 15 minutes from the house. The actual moving out was a Saturday, gray and cold, and I took Tyler to his soccer scrimmage to give her the space to do it without the 3 of us standing around the emptiness together. When we came home that afternoon, the closet was bare, the bathroom counter was cleared, and the house felt not empty exactly, but different, lighter in some ways, heavier in others. Tyler dropped his bag by the door, looked around the kitchen, and said, "You want me to start the pasta?" "Yeah," I said. "That'd be great." We cooked together without talking much, and it was exactly the right amount of silence. The divorce hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in March, in a courtroom on Salisbury Street that smelled like old carpet and institutional coffee. Russell had prepared meticulously. That was his natural state. And I arrived in a dark jacket and the calm of a man who had done every piece of preparation available to him and was ready for whatever the morning produced. Joanna sat across the aisle with her attorney, a competent woman named Patricia Hale who had a reputation for aggressive negotiation. Joanna looked composed but tired, the kind of tired that accumulates over weeks of disrupted sleep and difficult conversations. She didn't look at me when I walked in. I didn't need her to. The opening arguments were procedural and dry. Russell presented the asset documentation cleanly. The restructuring, the valuation, the holding entity, all of it organized with the precision of a man who had been quietly building this case since December. Patricia Hale raised objections in 3 places. The judge sustained one of them. The math still held. Then Russell called his witness. His name was David Kirby. He was a mid-level project coordinator at Crestline Solutions who had worked adjacent to Joanna and Shane's team for the duration of the Henderson account. He was 38 years old, mild-mannered, and visibly uncomfortable on the stand, which made him exactly as credible as Russell had predicted. David Kirby testified that on a Wednesday evening in November, he had stayed late in the office to finish a quarterly report. He had been in the break room when Joanna and Shane had entered, unaware he was there. He had heard their conversation, not deliberately, simply because the room carried sound. He testified calmly and without embellishment that what he had overheard was not a professional exchange. Patricia Hale cross-examined him sharply, pressing on his sight lines, his exact position, whether he could have misunderstood the context. David Kirby held his answers steady throughout. She said she didn't want to go home, he told the courtroom, his voice flat and factual. And she wasn't talking about being tired. The judge made a note. The financial portion of the hearing produced exactly the outcome Russell had architected, because Odom and Associates had been restructured into a holding entity prior to the filing date. Legally, cleanly, with full documentation, It sat outside the marital estate. Patricia Hale argued timing and intent with genuine energy. The judge listened carefully and ruled against her on both points. Joanna's alimony calculation was based on the joint accounts and personal assets remaining at the time of filing. The number was not insignificant, but it was a fraction of what it would have been if the business had remained exposed. Patricia Hale, to her credit, kept her expression neutral when the number was read into the record. Joanna did not. I watched my wife, my soon-to-be former wife, absorb that number and understand, in real time, the full scope of what the last 4 months had actually cost her. Not just the marriage, not just the career setback. The financial architecture she'd assumed was behind her had been quietly, legally, and completely rerouted. Outside the courthouse afterward, Russell and I stood on the steps in the March cold while he put his files away. "David Kirby held up well," I said. "He's a decent man," Russell replied. He didn't want to testify, but he said the right thing was the right thing. I nodded. Below us, downtown Raleigh moved through its ordinary Thursday morning. Delivery trucks, office workers, the whole indifferent machinery of a city that didn't particularly care about one man's divorce proceedings. "How long until it's final?" I asked. 60 days, Russell said. 90 at the outside. I buttoned my jacket against the cold. 90 days. After everything. After the long, careful winter of watching and waiting and building. 90 days felt almost manageable. Spring came to Raleigh the way it always does, slowly at first, then all at once. The dogwoods along our street bloomed in the second week of April, and Tyler noticed them before I did, which told me he was paying more attention to the world outside than he'd been letting on all winter. The divorce was finalized on a Tuesday in early April. Russell called me at 11 in the morning to confirm it. I was on a job site in Garner, reviewing concrete pours with my site foreman, and I stepped away to take the call. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. I thanked Russell, hung up, and stood in the gravel lot for a moment with the wind coming off the highway and the smell of fresh concrete in the air. Then I went back to work. That evening, I cooked dinner. Nothing special, chicken and rice, the weeknight staple Tyler and I had settled into, and we sat across from each other at the kitchen table the way we'd been doing for the past 2 months. He ate with the appetite of a kid who'd had soccer practice, and when he finished, he pushed his plate aside and looked at me with that deliberate expression he'd inherited directly from my side of the family. "Is it done?" he asked. "As of today?" I confirmed. He was quiet for a moment, processing. "How do you feel?" "Steady," I said, which was true. Not happy, not relieved in any dramatic sense. Just steady, the way a building feels when the last piece of the frame is in place and the whole structure can finally take its proper load. Tyler nodded slowly. Then he said, "I want to live here, Dad. Officially. I know Mom has her apartment, and I'll see her. I'm not trying to cut her off. But this is home." I looked at my son across the kitchen table. 14 years old, 6 months of watching the world, he'd grown up and reorganized itself around him. And here he sat making considered, measured decisions like a man twice his age. "I'll have Russell file the paperwork," I said. "Okay." He picked up his plate and took it to the sink. "Can we get a dog?" I laughed. The first full laugh I'd had in months. Genuine and unguarded. "Let's get through the spring first." He grinned over his shoulder. My son's grin, the one that still had the ghost of the 6-year-old I'd coached through his first baseball season, and started rinsing his plate. Russell filed the custody modification the following week. Joanna's attorney did not contest it in any substantive way. Whatever fight Joanna had left in her was directed elsewhere, toward rebuilding her professional standing, toward the slow work of reconstituting a life that Shane Pruitt's gravity had pulled apart. She and Tyler found their rhythm over the following weeks: Sunday dinners at her apartment, occasional weeknight calls, the careful architecture of a relationship being rebuilt on different terms. She never asked me for more than the settlement provided. I took that as the first honest thing she'd done in over a year. There was one afternoon in May that I keep coming back to. Tyler and I were in the backyard. I was replacing. He didn't say anything to that, just held the board steady while I drove the screw home. The call from Patrick Sears came on a Thursday morning in late May, while I was driving to a meeting with the Wake County Facilities Director about a new contract bid. "Spencer," Patrick said, with the particular tone he reserves for news that requires sitting down, I need you to pull over. I pulled into a gas station on Capitol Boulevard. Talk to me, Patrick. Donaldson Group made a formal offer this morning, he said, for full acquisition of Odom and Associates and its holding entity. He paused. $150 million. dollars. I sat with that number for a long moment. The gas station hummed around me. A delivery truck pulling in, a woman at the pump 2 spots over, the ordinary machinery of a Thursday morning that had no idea what had just been said inside my truck. Donaldson Group was a national commercial construction conglomerate that had been circling the mid-Atlantic market for 2 years. Patrick and I had discussed the possibility of acquisition interest the previous fall, abstractly as a long-term scenario, and I told him I wasn't interested in selling. Then winter had come, and everything had changed, and somewhere in the architecture of my restructuring, I'd left a door open that I hadn't consciously decided to open. What's the timeline? I asked. They want an answer in 3 weeks, Patrick said. Spencer, this is a serious number. I know what it is, I replied. I sat in that gas station for 20 minutes after I hung up. I thought about my father and the drywall summers and the first crew I'd hired at 28. I thought about the first municipal contract, the hospital wing, the county schools. I thought about the holding entity Patrick had quietly restructured in January, the one that now sat outside any marital claim, clean and legally mine alone, about to be worth 9 figures. I thought about Joanna and the settlement she'd received and the fraction of this number that it represented. Then I called Patrick back and told him to schedule the preliminary meeting. The story broke publicly in the second week of June, not as a leak, but as a required business filing once the deal entered its formal phase. The Raleigh Business Journal ran it on a Tuesday morning under a headline that described it as the largest commercial construction acquisition in Wake County history. By afternoon, it had been picked up by 3 regional outlets and 1 national trade publication. Russell called me at noon. Have you seen it? I've seen it, I said. How do you feel? Like a man who made good decisions in the right order, I replied. He laughed, that rare, full Russell Malone laugh that I'd heard maybe a dozen times in 20 years. I'd say that covers it. I learned later, through a mutual acquaintance, that Joanna had seen the article at her employment attorney's office, where she'd gone to review the final terms of her Crestline settlement. It had been sitting on the waiting room table, the Raleigh Business Journal folded open to the business section, my name and company in the headline. She'd read it in a waiting room chair while her legal situation was being resolved, which struck me as the kind of timing that life arranges without being asked. She didn't call me. I didn't expect her to. Tyler saw the article too. I'd left the journal on the kitchen counter that morning without any particular intention of drawing attention to it. When he came home from school, he picked it up, read it quietly at the island, and set it back down. That's the company you restructured, he said. It wasn't quite a question. Yes, I said. He looked at me steadily. Before you filed. Before I filed, I confirmed. He turned that over for a moment. Then he nodded with the quiet satisfaction of someone watching a well-constructed plan reach its conclusion. Good, he said simply, and went upstairs to start his homework. I stood in the kitchen where we'd eaten 1,000 ordinary dinners, looked out at the backyard and the fence we'd repaired together in the May afternoon light, and let the full weight of the last 8 months settle into something I could carry without effort. I hadn't set out to become a man who could absorb that kind of betrayal and come out the other side with everything that mattered still intact. I just hadn't been willing to become anything less. There's a difference between those two things, and I understood it now in a way I hadn't before. The summer stretched ahead. New contract, new chapter, my son in the next room doing his homework in the house that was ours. Whatever came next, I'd face it the same way I'd faced this, with my eyes open, my foundation solid, and the patient certainty that a man who builds things right doesn't have to worry much about what the weather brings.
Spencer didn't raise his voice. He didn't beg, he didn't chase, he didn't break, he just got quiet and got to work. And in the end, the man who built things for a living built something no one could take from him, his dignity, his son's respect, and a future entirely on his own terms. That's the kind of strength that doesn't make noise, but it lasts. Thank you for listening to this story. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you in the next one.